Well, welcome everyone. Bonjour, bonjour tout le monde. Donc, je me présente, je m'appelle Dominique Martin. Je suis professeur en éthique de l'intelligence artificielle et éthique des affaires à l'École des sciences de la gestion de l'Université du Québec à Montréal. So, welcome everyone. My name is Dominique Martin. I'm a professor of ethics at ethics of artificial intelligence and business ethics at the École des sciences de la gestion of the Université du Québec à Montréal. So this is our first conference this year in the Montreal Speaker Series in the ethics of AI. So I would like first to welcome all of you, to welcome our main speaker today, John Danaher, as well as Christine Tappolet and Éric Salobir, that will both be discussants for this talk. And finally, I would like to welcome all of you and to thank you for your continued participation and interest in the series. So I don't know if this is an expression of your interest or an effect of the COVID crisis, but we had more people registering for this conference today than we had for all the conferences in the series so far. So we take that, I think Martin Gibert and I were the co-organizer for the series, take that as a confirmation that our initial idea was right, our intuition, our objective to have this series and to invite a specific number of people, researcher in AI ethics based on their research work, and give them the talk and the time, in fact, to express their views and give us the time to think about these views and listen to them and then react on the views. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Maybe let me just say that, so we already have two other talks that are planned in the series. So on November 5th, Martin Gibert, that I just mentioned, will give a talk because he just published a book on AI ethics called Comment faire la morale au robot, and he will be presenting within the series in November. And then we will have a talk from Carissa Felice, who is based at Oxford University, a talk entitled Why Privacy Matters More Than Ever, and she will speak on December 3rd. All the information is on our website if you want to have a look. The link was available when you logged in the Zoom meeting. Otherwise, it's in the invitation. And I also want to mention that some of the talks we had last year are available on Zoom. And once again, the links are on our website. So you can have a look at the talk we had last year. Let me also mention that so Martin Gibert's talk in November will be in French. And the talk today will be in English. And most of the talk we will have this year will be in English because our main speakers are Anglophones. Before moving to the main talk, perhaps since this is our first event of the year, I would also like to take the time to thank our sponsors and partners for this series. So first, Ernst & Young and Anne-Marie Hubert, the MILA, the AI Research Institute here in Quebec, the Ivado Consortium, the research chair of Sébastien Gantz at UQAM. So the full name is la chaire de recherche du Canada en analyse respectueuse de la vie privée et éthique des données massives. The Center for Research and Ethics, the School of Management Sciences at UQAM, Humania at UQAM, and last but not least, the Observatoire International sur les impacts sociaux de l'IA et du numérique, or the International Observatory on the Social Impacts of AI and Digital Technology, or what we more commonly call simply the OVIA, who will take in charge the Zoom meeting today, and also the recording. So you may have noticed that the session was recorded today. So normally this series, the idea behind the series was to really meet physically in a room. That idea seems very weird just after a few months of confinement. And so this is how we proceeded for our first talks last year, but then we moved online because of the circumstances. All that to say, so we're having this meeting on Zoom, but you are invited to contribute in making this meeting as as human-friendly as possible and keeping your video feed open. Mute your microphone, please, however, because we're recording the meeting. So you're invited to keep your video feed open. With that said, we're recording the meeting, so if you don't want to be recorded, simply turn off your camera and turn off your microphone. The plan is to put this recording online on our YouTube channel with the other recordings of the other conferences. So the plan for today is to have the main talk for about 30 to 45 minutes. Then Christine and Éric will both have like between 5 and 10 minutes to make their comments. I will offer an opportunity to John Danaher to reply, and then there will be a Q&A from the public. For the questions from the public, I will ask everyone to keep their microphone muted. If you want to ask the question yourself, simply write your name in the chat and then I will give you an opportunity to speak. If you write your question, then I will read your question for you. As I said, the talk will take place in English, but if you want to ask a question in French, please feel free to do so and I will translate the question in English. And I can retranslate the answer in French also if this is necessary. Donc, très rapidement, je ne vais pas répéter toutes les indications là, que j'ai données en anglais, mais je veux simplement préciser que pour la période de questions, si vous voulez poser vos questions en français, je vous invite à le faire. Et à ce moment-là, je traduirai votre question pour le conférencier et les commentateurs. Et ensuite, je retraduirai la réponse si besoin est. Donc, vous êtes invité à poser votre question en français si ça vous semble préférable. Okay, so our conference today will be given by John Danaher, who is a senior lecturer in law at the National University of Ireland, Galway. He's the author of quite a few books, actually. First, Automation and Utopia, that was published at Harvard University Press in 2019. He is co-author of A Citizen's Guide to Artificial Intelligence, to be published at MIT Press in 2021. He's also the co-author of Robot Sex, Social and Ethical Implications, published at MIT Press as well in 2017. And he also published many other papers on topics, on the broad topic of AI ethics, including the risks of advanced AI, the meaning of life and the future of work, the ethics of human enhancement, the intersection of law and neuroscience, the utility of brain-based lie detection, and the philosophy of religion. I should also add that we're very excited to have him here. Martin and I, so we tried to invite you, John, last year, but it was not possible, unfortunately. But even already last year, we thought that you were, well, one of the authors that have been doing research in AI ethics, very serious work in the sense of very thorough work on the topic for quite a while now. So again, we're really happy to have you. Your talk today will be is entitled Robot, AI, and Moral Revolution. So without further ado, please go ahead.
Okay, so thank you for that introduction, Dominic, and thanks to both yourself and Martin for inviting me. Sorry, during the introduction there, I was distracted by Martin's cat crawling across his shoulders and across his face. I don't know if anyone else was watching that, possibly not. I would have been great to do this in person in Montreal. I'd love to go back there someday. I've only been to Montreal once before. My abiding memory of the last time I was there, and this might sound insulting actually now that I think about it to residents, was that most of the city was under some kind of construction. The roads were being dug up in some way. Anyway,
that's
that was
still
just
the case, unfortunately. That's still
that was the thing that struck me when I was there. But I'm going to share my presentation first to get started. Sorry now, hang on, actually. I have this not loaded up. I apologize for that. Just one point while I'm loading this up. For people who are watching this, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Zoom and how it works, but sometimes I think the default setting on a Zoom presentation is that the slides fill up the entire screen, and then the speaker is just a tiny little square in the top right-hand corner. You can actually adjust that if you want. You can go into the view screen options and set up a speaker side by side with the slide so that it doesn't have this strange effect where I look like I'm in a hole somewhere speaking out of a well or something to you. So that's just a suggestion for people who are watching. So as Dominic says, my talk is on robots, AI and moral revolutions, although I didn't change the title slide here because I'm going to focus mainly on robots, although I am interested in maybe the differences between robots and AI as well, which might affect the argument that I will make in this talk. And that might be something that is worth bringing up in the discussion afterwards. So this is actually part of a kind of ongoing project that I have. I'm interested in the way in which technology is shaping or changing our moral beliefs and practices, and how it might precipitate or cause moral revolutions. And the focus in this talk on robots is just one particular manifestation of that, but I'm interested in basically all the effects that technology might have on our moral beliefs and practices. So, part of the motivation for this talk is just the sense that there's a proliferation of robots in human life. Maybe some people feel that more acutely than others, but it certainly seems to be the case that there are more modalities and forms of robots that are designed to be more closely integrated into our social lives in different ways. The screen just shows some examples of them, the Now robot or the Nightscope security robot, self-driving cars, Roombas. There are many more examples that I could point to as well of devices that have been prototyped and come on the market in the past few years, which can speak to this proliferation of robots into our social lives. So an obvious enough point is that whenever you have a technology that is widely distributed and widely integrated into human social life, it's going to have some kind of impact on our behavior. And people often focus on those behavioral impacts and implications. Think about the debates that we are having, in relation to social media and addiction to social media, the effects that it has on political discourse, the effects that it is having on socialization and isolation and so forth. So the same is presumably going to be true of robots as they become more closely integrated into our lives. But I'm not just interested in the kinds of behavioral effects that it might have, the alterations to people's behavior. What I'm interested in is how it might alter our moral beliefs and practices, our sense of what is valuable, our sense of what is right or wrong. And I think you get a hint in a lot of the headlines you see in tabloid media and so forth of some of the potential effects that robots might be having on social life. So this is just a sample of headlines from different news websites highlighting concerns that people have about robots or changes in behavior being precipitated by robots. So people concerned about how they'll impact on work. Will they become our bosses at work? And how will that change the working environment? The uncanny feeling or perception people have of robots oftentimes. People marrying robots, having relationships with robots, people throwing funerals for robots, people having this sense again of creepiness about robots, sense of unease, and also, an emerging phenomenon of people attacking robots, seeing them as a physical threat that needs to be eliminated, or an existential threat that needs to be eliminated. Right, so what impact will this have on our moral beliefs and practices? And in particular, will the dispersion of social robots precipitate some kind of social moral revolution? And that's the question that I'm asking in this talk, and then I want to see if I can at least sketch a way of answering that question. Probably behooves me at the outset to explain or define some terms and some concepts. So let me try and explain a little bit what I mean by a moral revolution. I define a moral revolution as some kind of reasonably significant change in social moral beliefs and practices. And in fact, I'm more interested in the changes in moral beliefs. I can talk about why that might be the case. I'm not so much interested in the changes in people's and behavioral practices. I'm more interested in how they perceive what is valuable and what is right and wrong. Okay, and there's obviously a hedge within this definition. It's very vague and open-ended definition, and talks about a reasonably significant change. You know, what's a significant change? And these are things that are open to debate. And to be a little bit more precise about the concept of a moral revolution, you can go to moral theory, where we divide, you know, the branches of moral theory. There's two main branches. There's axiology, which is value theory, perceptions of what is good or bad, or beliefs about what is good or bad. And then there's deontology, which is beliefs about what is right and wrong, the moral rules that we're supposed to follow, the obligations that we have, the permissions that we have, and so forth. So I think you can actually be more precise about the concept of a moral revolution and talk about axiological revolutions, changes in value perceptions and beliefs about what is good for humanity, what is conducive to human flourishing, and so forth, and what is bad for humanity or human life. I mean, this is something we might get back to as well later in the discussion, but that's obviously a slightly anthropocentric interpretation or understanding of axiology, and maybe we want to qualify that to talk about value more generally outside of what is good or bad for human beings. And then a deontological revolution, some kind of change in what people believe is right or wrong, the moral rules that people believe they ought to be following. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a moral revolution, is some reasonably significant change in either axiological beliefs and practices or deontological beliefs and practices. Have there been moral revolutions in the past? So I don't know if this is a topic that people are listening in have investigated much or studied much, but there is a small and in fact growing literature on the idea of moral revolutions. Obviously, the study of the past is in many ways the study of political and social revolutions of various forms, and that's often what people examine when they study history, or if you've taken history courses in high school or whatever, that's often what you will have looked at. What's maybe less remarked upon many times is that these social political revolutions often are preceded by or come hand in hand with moral revolutions, changes in axiology and axiological beliefs and deontological beliefs. And as I say, there's an emerging literature on this topic. There's a couple of books written in the past decade on the concept of moral revolutions. Robert Baker wrote a book last year with the MIT Press called The Structure of Moral Revolutions, which for those of you with a background in philosophy or philosophy of science, you know, the title might ring a bell because it's modeled on or copies a lot of ideas from Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and talks about how you can use a similar model for understanding changes in moral beliefs throughout history. Also, Kwame Appiah has written a book about called The Honor Code, which looks at 3 specific moral revolutions. I'm sorry, now the robot in my life right now has switched on. So Siri has switched on in the background. I don't know if anyone could hear that. I must have said something that triggered her. So Kwame Anthony Appiah has written this book called The Honor Code, where he looks at 3 historical moral revolutions, and just drawing out of both books, here are some of the things that they point to as examples of historical moral revolutions. Okay, so the abolition of slavery, an obvious example of a moral revolution, a change in moral beliefs around whether slavery is a good thing or whether it's permissible, changes in beliefs around gay marriage, universal suffrage, dissection of the dead, the desecration of the dead, the growing acceptance of dissection of human bodies as being, you know, a permissible activity and possibly something that serves the good of science. Public urination, I put that in there because it's a very interesting case study in Robert Baker's book on the structure of moral revolutions. In particular, the permissibility of having locations in the public where women could urinate. He points to that being a moral revolution. It's the example in the opening chapter of his book. And he discusses something that I didn't know at all, that there was like an actual campaign, kind of similar to the suffrage campaign around allowing places for public urination in the UK. And then dueling the resolution of disputes between noblemen in Europe being through pistol duels, whether that was an acceptable practice, big shift in that behavior in the 1800s. And also foot binding in China, a change in the attitudes towards that. These are two examples from Kwame Apia's book on the honor code. I mean, those are just some illustrations of the fact that there have been, or it seems if you buy these examples, there have been moral revolutions in the past. And so I think it stands to reason that there probably will be moral revolutions in the future as well. Okay, that the moral beliefs that we hold to now, in 100 years' time, our grandchildren or great-grandchildren might look back and say that, God, our grandparents had some pretty abhorrent moral beliefs, and we don't agree with those anymore. And I think this has some important significance for any study of AI and ethics or technology and ethics. I think there's maybe two things that are significant about the fact that there have been moral revolutions in the past, and there probably will be again in the future. I think there's a practical value to studying potential future moral revolutions around, planning for different scenarios, anticipating potential changes in society. Things that we find objectionable now might actually be entirely acceptable to our children or great-grandchildren or grandchildren, or vice versa. Something that we find acceptable might turn out to be abhorrent to them. And there's also, I think, a moral value to studying potential future moral revolutions too, in that, again, some people don't buy this as much, and this might be something to draw out in the discussions, but I think we should approach our current moral beliefs with a certain degree of humility and accept that there is some uncertainty as to whether they are correct or incorrect. And for some people, that, again, the possibility of moral revolutions might trigger a kind of conservative reaction as well, that they worry that our current way of life, our current value system is under threat, and so we need to protect that. And so we have a moral duty maybe to prevent future moral revolutions. And other people as well who accept the possibility of future moral revolutions are concerned with being on the right side of history when it comes to morality. And this is, I picked that phrase in particular from the debate around gay marriage in the US. If you looked at a lot of the legal jurisprudence and the kind of conversation around pushing for the acceptance of gay marriage through the courts, that was an argument that was mentioned by a lot of people, that the courts want to be on the right side of the history when it comes to the moral permissibility of or acceptability of gay marriage, because the US Supreme Court historically was not on the right side of history for many famous issues. Okay. So I think studying moral revolutions has a practical value too, has a moral value too, because it encourages maybe a different attitude towards our current moral beliefs, and either a greater sense of attachment to them or a sense of humility towards them as well. Okay, so that's just background on moral revolutions. How might technology in general mediate or facilitate or encourage a change in morality, a revolution in morality? Okay, so what I'm going to do in this section of the talk is just outline some models for thinking about this. And I'm going to start with an example from a different author, a recent paper written by a guy called Stefan Steinert. It's actually about the coronavirus and social media, and talks about how social media expressions of negative emotion during the coronavirus pandemic might be precipitating or encouraging a change in values in different societies. Okay, so the centerpiece of his theory or model is that all humans have some kind of set of personal values, things that they care about. He applies a certain psychological theory of that, which I won't get into. They use these personal values to appraise information that they're presented to or events in their lives. So they engage in some kind of emotional appraisal of things that happen to them. These emotional appraisals turn into evaluative perceptions, so beliefs, perceptions about what is right or wrong that get expressed through their behavior in some way. So his theory then is that, yeah, so this is a mechanism for generating moral beliefs and practices. The coronavirus pandemic is an event that's occurring to everybody right now, or people are experiencing. People are appraising it emotionally, usually in a negative way. They perceive it as a threat to their existence. And they are expressing this kind of negative evaluative perception through social media. Social media platforms then share and distribute these negative perceptions, and in particular, the algorithmic curation of social media platforms is such that the negative emotional expressions tend to predominate, tend to be shared more widely. So this kind of kicks off a negative feedback cycle, or sorry, kicks off a positive feedback cycle in society, in the sense that it amplifies the negative emotional expression in society, in the world. Okay, so this is his kind of simple mechanism for how one technology, social media, might be amplifying a kind of moral change. It's going to push us towards having a more negative view of the world, sense that our identity and our way of life is under threat. And this encourages a shift towards values around security and stability. All right. So I think we can take that as a model then for understanding other kinds of value chain, or ways in which technology might shift societal values. And I'm going to outline kind of three nested ways of thinking about this. So I think you can think about how technology mediates moral change at an individual level, at a dyadic level or interpersonal level, and then at what I'm going to call an ecosystem level. Okay, so at the individual level, again, the human brain, following the Steinert's model, is a mechanism for generating moral beliefs and practices. It evaluates information and it generates moral perceptions on the basis of that evaluation of information. Okay, so if you have any kind of disruptive technology, I don't have a precise definition of this, but I mean a technology that tends to provoke some kind of strong emotional reaction and a corresponding moral perception, as in, like, this is a really good thing, or this is a really bad thing, some way. All right. So it's above the baseline level of evaluative perception that we have in society as it stands. And we're going to respond to that in some way. We're going to evaluate that technology. The way in which we evaluate it depends on the psychological machinery that we have in place, which is presumably a product of both evolution, which gives us some kind of basic platform for evaluating information, and then our own kind of personal history and development, our experiences, our culture, things that we've imbibed from others, that shapes the way in which we evaluate this disruptive technology. And that's either going to have one or two effects. I would suggest it's that they're going to amplify the kind of disruptive potential of the technology, or it's going to dampen it down in some way. Right? So what implications, so that's the kind of individual level for thinking about this. Sorry, I forgot that. Then you can think about this on a dyadic level or an interpersonal level. And this is actually the way in which a lot of people think about how moral beliefs and practices are sustained. They think about it through interpersonal models. And this is common in psychological literature on morality. People are interested. I could cite some examples of that. So again, you still have the individual machinery in place, but then you have people interacting with one another, and they generate kind of different perceptions of their duties to one another. They're perceived as agents of moral action and patients of potential recipients of harm or benefit through action. And their relationship occurs in some kind of context, some environment. Okay, and that environment sustains a certain pattern of moral beliefs and practices about their relationship, how they ought to behave towards one another, and what they value in one another's behavior. Most interpersonal interactions, and this is something I might talk about in more detail, because it's something I want to do in another version of this talk on a previous occasion, most of these interactions are based on a need to solve some kind of basic cooperative problem between people. So we generate moral beliefs and practices as a way of solving cooperative dilemmas that arise between people. So disruptive technologies come into this relationship, this dyad. They're going to provoke responses amongst the participants to that relationship. Evaluations might change the context of their interaction. And again, depending on the nature, the structure of that relationship between them, it's going to either amplify or dampen the disruptive potential of the technology. Okay, so that's the interpersonal dyadic level. So we have the individualistic level and the dyadic level. And then, one point that I think is more accurate is we have what I'm going to call the ecosystem level. Okay, so we have people that generate moral beliefs and practices within relationships, but these people operate within broader ecosystems. And moral ecosystems is what I mean as well, where the ecosystem is defined by the material environment that they operate in, and that includes kind of natural and built environment in which they operate, and the technologies that they use, because these generate possibilities for action. They constrain some actions, they permit or allow other actions. And they also then have a cultural or institutional environment that they operate within. Set of norms and scripts for behavior, a set of laws that define what they can and cannot do. Again, that give them different possibilities for action. And so you have disruptive technologies then that impact on the ecosystem. And the ecosystem, I should say, can be at different levels of abstraction. You can think about an ecosystem at a kind of entire societal level. You know, the entire country of Ireland, in my case, has maybe a certain kind of moral ecosystem, but then there's ecosystems at much more fine-grained level too, within companies, within universities, within certain families and so forth. So you have disruptive technologies that come into this moral ecosystem, the people within it evaluate the technology through their kind of interactions with one another within the relationships that they have, which occur within this ecosystem consisting of material and cultural environment. And depending on the nature of that ecosystem, it's either going to, again, amplify the disruptive potential or dampen it down in some way, okay? And there's actually a concept in here in moral ecosystem theory, which isn't particularly well developed, but is an idea that's out there that, some moral ecosystems are quite resilient to change. They tend not to be disrupted that much, but other moral ecosystems are quite fragile. So events that occur to them can destabilize the entire moral ecosystem and then precipitate some kind of moral revolution. Okay. I think I may have, I can't see the relevant part of the screen here myself. I can't figure out how to, so that's right. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I had the image correct. Okay, so that's kind of these three levels of thinking about the mechanism underlying moral revolutions: the individual level, the dyadic level, and the ecosystem level. So what I'm interested in then is if we have robots coming into our moral ecosystems, what kind of impact is that going to have on our moral beliefs and practices? So the robot is the disruptive technology. How does that get evaluated and perceived within the given ecosystem? Okay, so I think there's two questions then that arise. One is, well, if robots are going to precipitate some kind of moral revolution, then it has to be the case that our moral ecosystems amplify whatever disruptive potential they have. So what might encourage the amplification of disruptive potential? What drives this amplification? Here are just some suggestions for what might drive it. How people perceive and evaluate robots is somehow inconsistent with or threatens or undermines the existing values and norms within the ecosystem. The material culture in which people operate gives them more opportunities to amplify the inconsistent perception. Okay, so think back to Stefan Steinert's model of how the coronavirus pandemic might be encouraging a shift to a more negative security-centric value system. It's because the social media technology, which is part of the material culture, amplifies the negative emotional perception of the pandemic. So is something similar going to happen with robots? Is whatever perception that we have of them going to be amplified within the material culture? And also then, is the institutional culture going to encourage or amplify the inconsistency? I mean, this is something to think about in particular when it comes to robots. Let's say laws. How does the law interpret and understand what a robot is, and whether who can be held responsible for the actions of a robot? All these kind of typical questions that arise in robot ethics and AI ethics. Okay, is the institutional culture such that it amplifies the inconsistent perception? Okay, so the last bit of the talk then, try and answer this question in relation to robots. What is our moral perception of robots? Okay, how do we perceive them? Do we perceive them in a way that is somehow, let's say, inconsistent with the moral beliefs and practices that currently dominate within our moral ecosystems? Now, I can't answer this in a very comprehensive way, because one of the features of the model that I'm developing here is that it's going to depend a lot on the particular moral ecosystem you're interested in. Okay, but I can kind of again begin to sketch an answer to this question, whether robots will precipitate some kind of social moral revolution. So first of all, what are the basic possibilities when it comes to how people perceive robots in a way that might be threatening to our moral beliefs and practices? So one of the big debates and issues in robot ethics and human-robot interaction is whether people perceive or understand robots to be agents that kind of bear the same moral properties as humans, or as tools, or as something else. Okay, so there's probably a spectrum of possibilities here, but I would say there's maybe three basic categories that we could slot robots into. We could see robots as tools, in the sense that they have no moral agency, they have no moral patiency, they're not objects of moral concern, none of our moral norms are binding on them. They are merely expressions of and extensions of human moral agency. And that's a view that's favored by many robo-ethicists. We can perceive robots to be what I'm going to call quasi-agents. Maybe there's a better term we could use here. Uncanny agents, I don't know. Where they have some kind of agency, maybe some kind of patiency too, but they're not recognized as being the equivalent to human moral agents. So they're different but similar to us. And as such, because they're different but similar, they are more threatening to the stability of our moral systems, which again, go back to part of my argument, I think is premised on the need to solve cooperative problems. So if robots become our partners in what would historically be cooperative endeavors, like let's say in the workplace or in government or when we're driving to work, it might threaten the stability of our normative practices in those different domains if they're different from human agents, but similar in some ways. And then the third possibility is that robots are somehow full agents, basically the same as human agents. And so they're normal potential cooperative partners. My basic diagnosis is that if they're perceived as tools, they're probably not going to threaten or undermine our moral ecosystem. So they're not going to precipitate a social moral revolution. If they're perceived as agents, quasi-agents, they probably will, because that's the most uncertain or destabilizing perception. And if they're perceived as full agents, they probably won't, although there's one qualification to that, because in the sense that humans are always kind of perceive other human agents as potential threats to their way of life or anything like that, and that can have a disruptive impact on their moral beliefs and practices. And that's the lesson that history teaches us clearly. Okay, so then the question is the last thing I want to end up on in the talk, but I do have a little bit more to say, is that, well, where does the evidence currently point? If you look at social psychology and human-robot interactions, how do people in fact perceive robots? It seems to me anyway, that the predominant view in the literature is that the middle option predominates, that people perceive robots as quasi-agents, not quite full human agents, not quite tools, different but similar to us. And that is, I think, probably the most destabilizing form of perception. And I think there are a couple of interesting things about the way in which robots are perceived as quasi-agents. So very briefly, some people might be familiar with this set of studies by Bertram Mal et al. On what he calls the asymmetry effect, which is that when presented with vignettes anyway, involving robots acting in moral dilemmas. So the first study he did was on the classic trolley dilemma. Imagine it's a robot versus a human who has to make the critical moral choice in the dilemma. People tend to believe that robots should follow a more utilitarian set of norms. Okay, they blame robots for inaction more than they blame humans for inaction. And also, one of the other studies that Mal et al. Have done suggests that within the context of military organizations, so a vignette involving a military drone, either one that's completely autonomous or one that's controlled by humans, the autonomous drone is not held to be part of the hierarchical structure of the military, in the sense that we don't believe that there's some kind of like, I was just following orders excuse for robots. They should follow whatever the kind of pure, again, utilitarian norm is in that scenario, rather than the more human kind of cooperative norm that you want to keep the military institution together. So that's an interesting set of findings from human-robot interactions, although again, it's not really human-robot interactions, it's vignette studies of how people think about robot moral actions that suggest that different norms apply to robots. People perceive different norms to apply to robots. The second thing that it seems clear from the literature, and this is fairly basic, is that the kind of uncertain status of robots creates problems for how we collaborate and interact with them. It often creates friction within our interactions with robots. It slows down task performance when we're uncertain how to categorize a robot, whether it's a moral agent or a moral patient. There's a perception that robots are often perceived as agents, but not patients, and they're deemed creepy and weird if they are more patient-like. And again, there's a set of studies that you can find out there. And then a final finding from the literature is that all of this is highly context sensitive. So our perception, again, of whether robots are mere tools or quasi-agents depends significantly on how the robot looks, how it behaves, and the kind of task that we ask it to perform. Okay, so one recent finding from Dennis Kuster and his colleagues is that the more human-like the behavior of the robot, the more likely we are to believe that it's an intentional moral agent of some kind. And that matters a lot more than whether it's human-like in appearance. Robots that have benevolent displays, benevolent behavioral cues, seem to give people things or help people out, are more likely to be perceived as moral patients, as potential recipients of harm, and more likely to have perceived as having minds. And then again, another finding from Marchese et al. Is that the specific type of task that the robot is performing is likely to impact on whether it's perceived to have some kind of moral status or moral agency. And if it's performing simple mechanical tasks like stacking shelves, it's less likely to be perceived as belonging to our moral community or having a liminal status in our moral community. But if it's playing a game with us, we're more likely to perceive it as part of our kind of moral community, as an agent that we're interacting with. So this is the last slide, you'll be glad to hear. What are the implications of all of this? Well, here's a few suggested implications. Again, the liminal status of robots, I think, challenges our moral ecosystems. When robots are perceived as quasi-agents, not quite human-like, this has a destabilizing impact. If they are perceived as merely different from us, but non-threatening, following the Mal et al. Studies, it seems that different moral norms are seen to apply to them. So as they become more integrated into our social lives, this may precipitate a shift to a different kind of set of norms that we think should govern our social lives. Maybe in particular, a more utilitarian set of norms should govern our lives. If they're perceived as somehow threatening or weird or creepy, this may prompt kind of defensive responses to them. So increased kind of robot-directed discrimination or dehumanization. They put those terms in scare quotes because they're probably not being used in the sense that a lot of philosophers might like them to be used. But again, a sense that these liminal objects, these uncertain objects, are a threat to our moral way of life. And that might have a similar effect to what Steinhardt talks about when it comes to the coronavirus and its impact on our value systems. It's going to shift towards security and stability. We need to be protected from the threat of robots. But again, all of this is going to vary very much on the precise contours of any particular ecosystem that you're looking at. So robots in a warehouse might be perceived as less threatening to our moral way of life than robots in a care home or robots that are asked to play games with our children or something like that. All right, that's all I wanted to say. I apologize if I went on too long. Hopefully that was all right. And I look forward to the comments and discussion. Thanks.
All right. Well, I think you deserve a round of applause, whether it is virtual applause or real ones. Well, thank you. No, so that was perfect in terms of time. So thank you very much once again. So now we will have a comment from Christine Tappolet. So Christine is a professor of philosophy at the University of Montreal, but also the director of the Research Center in Ethics. And so where she has been working for many years now on questions of ethics and more specifically meta-ethics. I would even say like the role and the impact of emotions on moral deliberation or behavior. So probably you'll have a lot to say on in that regard. So I'll let you make your comment, Kristen. You have about 5-10 minutes. So please go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Dominique, and thanks for the opportunity to think about those really interesting ideas. I have the feeling that I'm not going to go very deeply into these ideas because I mainly focused on the abstract and the slides, which are a bit difficult to understand when I was preparing my comments. So sorry for that. I hope it will be useful nonetheless to start the discussion. I wanted to say one or two things about myself before I start. Just first to apologize for my bad accent. I was born in Geneva in Switzerland. Please don't say I have a German accent. That's very annoying because it's definitely not a German accent. The other thing I wanted to say is that as Dominique said, I am a philosopher, and what is worse, I do meta-ethics. So that's the branch of ethics that's concerned with the most abstract questions like the objectivity of moral judgments. And as you see, that will play a role in how, in the questions I was interested in when thinking about those issues. Okay, so I wanted to start with points of agreements. In the abstract, there is this quote which I have on my PowerPoint, which I want to read. And when reading that, I said, yes, I I'm fully in. I couldn't agree more with this. So let's read that point, that quotation. I conclude the paper by considering the implication of this approach to studying the impact of robots on moral system for the traditional approach to robot ethics, suggesting in particular that the field needs to broaden its scope and take seriously the possibility that existing moral norms and standards are mistaken. Maybe that's me not copying, this should encourage probably greater humility among both ethicists and robotists when it comes to understanding the ethics of robotics. It's the italics are mine. So yes, I'm fully on board, and hence I also agree that there can actually, I believe there should be changes in the norms that we accept in our beliefs. We might be wrong. I think that's quite important. And also, we should be, we should have more humility in terms of what we know regarding moral facts. And of course, if this is true, then I agree as well that new technology, particularly things involving the uncanny robots and the possibility that they afford can induce and acquire change in the norms that we accept. So I'm fully on board with that. So maybe I should just stop here, and but that's not what I want to do. The question I was interested in was, what are the kind of changes that should be envisaged? And actually thinking more about that, maybe John will just agree and say, I'm fully on board with what you say. We should focus on a different question, but let's raise the question nonetheless. I mean, are the changes that are envisaged superficial or deep? Right? This is not a particularly precise way of expressing myself, but here are some examples of what I take to be superficial changes. So reality or our belief about non-moral facts can change. And what our moral principles entail in terms of what we ought to do can change as well. If there is a new fact, or if we have new beliefs about the facts, then there might be changes about what we ought to do. Something which does not need to come with any changes at the level of the moral principles themselves or at the moral facts themselves. So if you take an example, realizing that animals can suffer is of course something that should make changes in terms of what we do to animals. So this, I think, is in a sense a very important change, but in another sense, it's still a superficial change. Changes in our beliefs about moral principle, I take to be in this vague sense superficial as well, compared to changes in the principle themselves or in the moral facts. So these changes would concern facts or general moral principle, not the application of the principle to concrete reality, and nothing about the moral facts themselves. So the question is, what kind of changes would these new technologies bring with them? And this is a question that I think is depends on some meta-ethical debates, and I guess there might be a disagreement between me and John. Maybe not, maybe we'll agree on everything and we can go out for beers, or could have gone out for beers had we been all in Montreal. So let me say a word about what I called here my outlook. It's partly meta-ethical and partly normative. If you don't agree with that, just take it as an assumption, and then from that assumption we can think about what it entails. So first, usually on my good days, I'm a moral realist. It means that I believe that there are moral facts, such as facts concerning what is right or wrong, what is good or bad. And these facts are real objective facts. They do not depend on a subjective stance or what we believe or what we feel. even though they're a bit hard to figure out. I have some views about the epistemology of moral facts, but that's not relevant here, I believe. And then in terms of normative ethics, on my good days, I'm a moral consequentialist. That is, I believe that what agents ought to do is act in ways that promote the good. And the good is, in my view, something complex. It's something that's not just to be spelled out in terms of one dimension like utility or one dimension like pleasure. It involves several dimensions, several things can be considered or should be considered to be good. And I list a few here on my PowerPoint: knowledge, justice, happiness, pleasure. The list is not complete, and maybe it's not exact as well. So this is my moral outlook. A first question, and that's something that didn't really, I think, appear in your presentation, John, but had a role in your abstract. You talk about the assumptions concerning human morality, and you say that your assumption is that human morality is usually agent or agency-centric, and also that it's mainly concerned with solving cooperation problems. So does the normative ethics that I'm usually subscribing to, does it count as a human morality in your sense? And I think it's sort of not completely the case, because yes, consequentialism is a theory that tells what agents ought to do, so it's agency-centric, but then the values that ought to be promoted are not necessarily related to agents. You have non-human animals, if they can feel pleasure, which is surely the case, and pain, then, which is also the case, then they can be considered to be moral patients, even they're not moral, not necessarily moral agents. And consequentialism is also not really on board with the idea that ethics is, or morality is mainly concerned with solving cooperation problems. Cooperation is something that ought to be promoted insofar as it leads to the promotion of the good, but only insofar as it does. So it's very limited. So there might be some disagreements here about what counts as, you know, a good moral system. Now, this is the conclusion of what I wanted to say. What about the moral revolution? Is it going to be something that I would qualify as a superficial change, or would it entail something that entails deep changes? So will any fact regarding robots require a moral revolution? So I would agree that yes, in a superficial sense, and in a sense that might be important for our lives. So when I say superficial, I do not want to say that it has no importance at all, not at all. So we might discover that robots can feel pain, and that's something that, you know, might come from the sense of uncanniness that we have when we deal with robots. And so then we would have to auto change how we interact with them, just as I illustrated in the case of non-human animals. But as far as I can see, these changes would be superficial in the sense I introduced, because they do not concern moral facts or principle. I wouldn't have to stop being a consequentialist, and I wouldn't have to change my meta-ethical outlook when dealing with robots, unless of course the robot is a philosopher, but that's an assumption that's not yet warranted. So here are the main points I wanted to make. What I thought, because I work mainly on emotions, what I thought was particularly interesting is the role you attributed to emotions in the changes. And maybe a follow-up question that's not connected to my previous comments is, how exactly is it that emotions would have a change that does not concern only how we perceive the uncanniness or the dangerousness of the robot when we feel fear, for instance, the dangerousness of the robot? How is it that these emotions can induce changes that are more general, that concern not only security with respect to the robots, but security in general? This is something that I'd like to see and understand. It was part of what you suggested, but it seems to me that if you consider fear, it's clear that fear will change how you will, react to something. If you perceive it as dangerous because of your fear, I agree with that. But I don't see how fear will contaminate other domains or have a more general impact. Okay, I'll leave it at that. So,
all right, thank you
I'll
very much.
Myself.
Thank you very much, Christine. Well, we'll have a chance to come back and discuss all of this, but I feel like I should say right now that I think philosophical disagreement as a fact about the world should never be a reason to have or not have a beer with someone. So I strongly disagree with that part of your intervention. Although all the rest...
I do agree. I do agree. Particularly if you disagree, you should have beers.
Thank you. Okay. Our last discussant is Éric Salobir, who has many hats, actually. So he's the president of Optic. I'll let you perhaps define what is that organization more specifically, but it's a network of researcher and business leader and other actors, in fact, on issues related with artificial intelligence, among other things, and technology. He's also the founder of the Institut de la Technologie pour Humains, and also the president of the Aspen Institute, if I'm not mistaken. But you are also a Roman Catholic priest and a member of the Dominican Order, and you were at least a member of the Vatican Media Committee. That is part of the Secretary of the State of the Vatican. So, Éric, you have 5 to 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dominique. First of all, I would like to thank John and Christine for the great insights. And actually, I will speak from a very different point of view. As you said, Dominique, I run a think tank and a research network, but which is, I would say, I will try to have a non-academic point of view. Perhaps this is like speaking from the dark side of the force, but this is who I am. And what I try to say perhaps is just to question a couple of things. First of all, and you say that, Christine, in an interesting way, it's a question of reality and versus perception. And my feeling is that, I mean, we know that, for example, we are much more empathetic with people who look like us. And there are some studies showing that we are more empathetic for people who are beautiful, for example. And so the question is it the way we want to build ethics, or is that something which is behind? And that's why I would not, let's say, use the terms of moral belief, for example, even if humility is great, but for example, non-discrimination, ethical discrimination, or prevention of pedophilia, or I mean, being against violence against women, all of that is much more than just a belief. And so the point is just perhaps what's behind that. And John, I like your point, but for me, there's one step before the disruptive technology is who makes this technology. Because currently, when we talk about robots, let's be honest, I mean, it's just like a machine, but nothing more. Even if it's like, it can be like human-like or whatever, it can be cute, it can be scary or whatever, but actually behind is just a machine. And in the machine, what's key for us in terms of ethics, it's the algorithm which runs the machine. So it's the AI, and AI is just algorithms and data. And the point is who writes the algorithm, who selects the data, and that's what makes the difference. And for me, I would say, yeah, for sure, there can be a revolution. And we see that each time there's a digitalization, that's an opportunity to reshuffle some ethical principles. Because, I mean, I work a lot with tech leaders. And if you come in a company and if you implement even a very basic IT system, you need to know if it's a 1 or a 0. You need to know if it's a yes or if it's a not. So it's the opportunity to clarify a couple of things, and for sure to change our mind on a couple of things. I agree fully. And also we see that the way we use AI changes probably the way we act, not only how we do things, but what we do. And I just take one example is the example of using an AI instead of a judge to decide which convict can be paroled or not, which is done in the United States, in many states in the USA. But actually, the point is not only that there can be biases in data or in the algorithm, which is the case, because we said that, or they said that the AI will not be racist. They will never have any prejudice against anybody, but that's not the case because it's fed with all the data. And in the United States, 1 out of 2 crimes involves a Black man. And for sure, the AI can consider that those people are more dangerous. But the key point is, for me, in a deeper way, that we switch from judging by causality, if I do something bad, I go to jail, to a judgment by correlation. I'm in the bucket of the people who are white, male, living in Europe, Catholic priest, and whatever, and I'm supposed to behave that way. And if I am the minority report, if I'm the one, the APAC, the one who doesn't behave like the others, I will be judged and considered like the others. And actually, that's a key point in the way we consider justice. So behind in the way, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing that really change the way we act collectively in a society. And for me, the point is just that we don't see, very often, we don't see that when we change the way we do things, we also change what we're doing. And perhaps that's what we need to take in consideration collectively. So not only to see the way the robots change things, but the way we collectively decide to change things, because behind the robot, there's someone who builds it, as I said, but also the way things are changed just because it changes, but we don't see it very obviously in the society. And for me, the key of the revolution is more there, and it's more like a clarification on what we're currently doing. And for me, that can help to distinguish if I would say something is really disruptive for our ethical system or if it's not. So more or less, that's what I wanted. I mean, I just discovered your paper now. So this is roughly what I wanted to share with you, and probably I will jump in the conversation later. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Eric, for these comments as well. Okay, so John, do you want to respond? So we have about 45 minutes left to the meeting. So if you want to take, I don't know, 5 minutes, a bit more maybe, to respond to these comments, and then we can open to question and discussions with the public.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for both sets of comments. I had interacted with Christine by email in advance, and I noted that it was difficult to construct a response to the paper because I didn't really share much of substance with either of you in advance. I appreciate you taking the time and effort to respond to what little I had provided and to the talk that I just gave. So let me take some of Christine's comments first. There's this issue of whether the kinds of revolutions or changes that I'm envisaging are superficial or deep. So are they just changes in beliefs about, I guess, beliefs about potential objects of subjects of moral principles, maybe? So, to whom we owe a duty, or what things might promote values, but the underlying values and principles themselves are relatively abstract and timeless and universal in some sense. They're just kind of a fixed part of the moral reality that we are discovering through our kind of social epistemic practices or something like that. I suppose, like, the simple answer is that I am probably just interested in the superficial changes, and those are the kinds of changes that I'm interested in. So whether whether we view robots as cooperative moral partners who bear the same duties as us, or to whom we owe similar duties as we owe to other moral patients. So I think that's a question that does have important kind of significance for society. And again, if you look at historically at the things that I'm calling moral revolutions historically, that they seem to be really changes in, or changes of a superficial kind. That we ought to respect all human beings, or all people who we recognize as sharing the same identity or status as us. That's maybe like an abstract moral principle, but what's changed over time is the community to whom we think we owe that duty, who belongs to that. I mean, the one thing I would push back on in relation to that, however, is that I think that there is a problem with kind of sticking to the view that principles are, in a sense, these kind of timeless and unchanging things, which is that moral principles can be stated at a very high level of abstraction. That means they are oftentimes provide very little guidance in the real world when it comes to real moral decision making. So if you take something like consequentialism, like I could state that at a very abstract level as you ought to do whatever promotes the good. Okay, but that's or promotes the most good or does the least bad or something like that. That's interesting, I guess, but then there's a more substantive, important question as to, well, what is good and what activities, what states of affairs do we attach that property of goodness to? And that is something that can expand and contract over time, or we can change our beliefs and perceptions about what is good promoting over time. And that seems to be in some sense a more interesting question, at least on a practical level. I think the same thing is true, again, if you take like an abstract statement of a Kantian principle, you ought to respect other agents as ends in themselves or something like that. And the question is who belongs to the community of agents that you ought to respect as ends in themselves, and that, again, that community can expand and contract over time, and that seems to me to be maybe the more interesting question. So yeah, you don't have to give up being a consequentialist in kind of world that I'm envisaging, but I think it's possible that some of your kind of day-to-day moral principles, your more kind of fine-grained principles by which you live and act, change, and it still seems to be worthwhile to study that. Is morality agency-centric? Is the question. Well, my view on that is that I think it's not in one sense, but it is in another. So again, I don't think axiology or our beliefs about what kind of states of affairs in the world are good are necessarily agency-centric. I think many of our beliefs about what is good or bad are tied to some conception of human flourishing, but you can, of course, have perceptions of what is good and bad that are linked to animal flourishing or the state of the natural environment, a common view in environmental ethics. So it's not that agents are promoting the welfare of agents is not necessarily the goal of morality. But I do think that the deontological portion of our ethics, or our beliefs about what is right and wrong, is agency-centric, in the sense that it is only agents that can be have a duty to follow these kinds of moral norms or principles, or who are bound to or expected to abide by them. I won't get into the question about whether cooperation is kind of the core of morality. You were looking at a set of slides I had from a previous talk where I made that more the centerpiece of my talk. And what I'm actually relying on there is a particular theory from anthropology about the origin of human moral systems. It's a theory called morality as cooperation, which argues that when you examine the kind of ethnographic record, looking at the way in which moral norms and principles are expressed in different societies, they are all rooted in some kind of an attempt to solve a cooperative dilemma. So it's an attempt at empirical theory about how human moral systems have developed over time. I don't think it's inconsistent with what you said, because the core assumption within it is that cooperation is defined quite broadly in that theory, so that a cooperative dilemma is any scenario in which having two or more people coordinate on some kind of set of rules tends to promote the good, whatever that means. There's a kind of non-zero benefit to their interaction, as a way it's sometimes expressed. And then there are many different kinds of I think there's, I won't go into it, but there are several thousand different moral norms or principles that can be generated from that seem to map onto the moral practices that we find in actual human societies. In terms of the role of emotions, then I think the effect of emotions is probably superficial to some in your kind of vocabulary. It affects the superficial moral beliefs and practices, I would suspect. Again, what we perceive as a threat, or what we perceive as good for us, what we evaluate as good for us, the kind of objects of our evaluative appraisals is what changes, as opposed to some like change to the value of security itself. So the idea is that security is one of the things that we value. We also value diversity, openness to different experiences and things like that. But our attachment to those values can vary depending on which emotion happens to dominate in our kind of cognitive worldview or framework at any given time. So if we experience more fear, express more fear, we become more attached to security as a value. But it's always kind of lurking there, and most people have the disposition or tendency to find security valuable. As for Eric's comments, then, so I mean, the first thing about the issue of reality versus perception, I take it that the concern there is that if we make morality a matter of perception or belief, if that's our view, is that what matters is kind of changing perceptions and beliefs, that seems to make morality quite fickle and not sufficient to kind of support the values that we care about. Again, because people's attitudes towards violence towards women or gay marriage and all these kinds can vary for particular social and cultural reasons, or kind of accidental historical reasons. And we don't want morality itself to be so contingent on social facts and moral beliefs or perceptions. And I mean, I think that's kind of similar to Christine's point about the superficial versus deep changes in morality over time. And I think, we certainly don't want many of our moral beliefs and practices to be so fickle and open to change. But I mean, one thing I would struggle with is that it seems to be the case that, although that is the view of moral philosophers and ethicists, but in practice, what is deemed to be morally acceptable and what is kind of sustained as a moral belief over time is dependent on the attitudes and beliefs of a community and the institutional framework within which they operate. That at a certain threshold, if people don't perceive a dominant norm to be legitimate or acceptable anymore, there will be some kind of change in it, and that seems to be what's happened over time. And I suppose the reason why I argue for some kind of humility or suggest that we should have some kind of humility towards our current set of moral beliefs and practices is because we've seen this process happen over time, that moral beliefs that were dominant in society have changed, and things that we thought were permissible, telling racist jokes or something was deemed to be acceptable, or sexist jokes at one point in time have now become unacceptable in a way that even within our lifetimes seems quite dramatic to some people. Okay, and you might lament that, or you might think it's a good thing, but it does seem to be what happens over time. The other question that you had then about, our focus should really be on who builds these technology, who creates the technology, who designs the algorithms that robots and other systems run on. I would say that that is a beautiful expression of the tools-based view of these systems, that these systems are just tools, they're not autonomous from human agents, and that we should view them as just tools of either individual human agents or collections of human agents, and we should be evaluating and scrutinizing their decision-making when they release these systems into the world. And that is, again, very much a dominant view amongst people in kind of robot ethics and AI ethics, that we should kind of stop this perception of robots as quasi-agents or AI systems as quasi-agents. We should try to push back against that and view these systems as tools of human agents, kind of pull back the veil and see them for what they really are. And that's fine. My only point about that is that the question then is for me, and going back to these superficial kinds of moral changes, is that might be the view that robot ethicists want, or AI ethicists want people to adopt, but how do people actually perceive these systems when they interact with them? And you kind of have to acknowledge or engage with that perception. So if you're worried about people viewing robots as quasi-agents, you need to argue very stringently and carefully for designing these systems in a way that people don't generate that perception. All right, that they don't have that misconception of what they are. Yeah, and I suppose, look, just one final point on that is that let's take the example of the robot judge judging by correlation as opposed to causation, because somebody belongs to a category of wrongdoer as opposed to actually being the cause of wrongdoing. I suppose one interesting question there is, again, you might view that as problematic and an issue, but if you apply something like Bertram Mal's work to how people perceive or understand the norms that automated systems should abide by, well, one challenge that might arise is that people think that robot judges should adopt a more kind of utilitarian set of decision-making norms, where actually focusing on correlative patterns is acceptable in that case, because it's the thing that does the most good or reduces the likelihood of crime and the highest level. I'm not saying that's true, by the way. I'm just saying that might be a perception that people have. And so they don't hold them to the same kinds of standards or rules as human systems. Again, that's a problem with the perception of these systems as quasi-agents. But again, it's a problem that you might need to be addressed if you want to avoid that kind of moral change. That's all I'll say.
May I?
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so now we will open our virtual floor to question and discussions from the public.